St Albans Abbey, England, 1315. A monk named Johannes de Trocolo takes up his pen and writes a few lines in his chronicle that will outlive him by 700 years. Listen to what he wrote. In the year of our Lord 1315, a constant fall of rain, such as had not been seen in our time, so that the crops could not ripen. He wrote it down because he was a chronicler, keeping the annals of his great abbey. He wrote about the flooded roads. He wrote about the gray sky that hung over the fields of Hertfordshire week after week, refusing to clear. And the worst part isn't the mud or the ruined roads or the endless unbroken gray of the English spring. The worst part is the long, quiet absence that followed it. The deadliest force in the medieval world was not the sword. It was not the fire of a raiding army or the wrath of a king or even the plague. The deadliest force was the weather. And when the great catastrophe came, it did not announce itself with a trumpet or a sudden blow. It arrived with a gentle pattering sound on a thatched roof. Drum, drum, drum. Welcome to History for Sleepyheads. Tonight, we're walking back 7 centuries into the damp, cold twilight of the 14th century. We are walking into the Great Famine of 1315. It is hard, in our world of global shipments and brightly lit supermarkets that never close, to understand how fragile a civilization can be. But in the year 1315, there was no safety net. There was only the soil and the seed and the sun. If the sky turned against you, there was nowhere else to go. You belonged to the harvest now. For 3 years across the north of Europe, the rains simply would not stop. The wheat rotted in the fields, the barley molded in the ear, and then the rye. The coastal salt pans flooded in the storms, leaving no way to preserve what little meat remained. 1/10 of the population, millions of people, from the shores of Ireland to the distant borders of Russia, would slowly, quietly starve to death in the cold. This is the story of a world that lost its bread. It is not a story of sudden violence or quick collapse. A famine has no single terrible moment. It is a long, patient descent. It did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. We will look at the empty granaries. We will look at the soaring price of a quarter of wheat, recorded on manorial rolls by careful clerks. We will look at a people who believed the sky was weeping because of their sins, and who marched barefoot into the mud to beg for mercy from a heaven that remained bitterly, stubbornly closed. It is a heavy story, but a deeply human one. So get comfortable, settle into the dark, close your eyes, listen to the rain on the thatch, let the modern world fall away, and let us step into the quiet, gray fields of 1315, where the sky is just beginning to turn. St Albans, England, 1315. A monk named Johannes de Trocolo takes up a pen and writes a single passage in his chronicle that will outlive him by 700 years. Listen to what he wrote. In the year of our Lord 1315, apart from the other distresses with which England was afflicted, hunger grew in the land, meat and eggs began to fail, capons and fowl could hardly be found, animals died of a sudden pestilence, and the earth failed to yield its fruit. He wrote it down because he was the keeper of the abbey's annals, a man tasked with remembering. He recorded the flooded roads, the sky that hung like lead over Hertfordshire, the wet earth that simply swallowed the seed. And the worst part isn't the mud, or the failing fowl, or the flooded salt pans on the coast. The worst part is the next thing he wrote. He noted quietly that the rain had begun at Pentecost, and that it simply did not stop.
He was a monk at St Albans, and he wrote down what he saw. And what he saw did not begin with a sword. It did not begin with a fire. It did not begin with a sickness sweeping through the towns. It began with rain. It began in the spring of 1315 with an ordinary, unremarkable gray rain that came and did not go. Nobody knew that first wet summer that they were watching the beginning of 3 years that would put a tenth of the north of Europe in the ground. They only knew the hay would not dry. To understand the apocalypse of the 14th century, you have to unlearn everything you know about how the world ends. We are conditioned to expect fire or a sudden shattering collapse, but the Great Famine arrived in a whisper. The spring of 1315 began like any other. The fields were plowed, the furrows were turned to shed the water, the seed was broadcast by hand into the dark, cold earth. And then, around the festival of Pentecost, which fell in mid-May that year, the sky clouded over. It started as a typical spring rain, the kind that was essential for softening the soil and waking the dormant seeds. But the days stretched into weeks, and the sky did not clear. The sun simply vanished behind an unbroken blanket of low, heavy clouds. The light turned silver, then slate, then gray. The sound of that year was the rain on the thatch. It was a patient, relentless drumming on the roofs of every cottage and manor house from the Irish Sea to the Russian steppes. The thatch on the roofs, meant to shed water, grew heavy and saturated, weeping into the hearths below. The wool cloaks were heavy with damp. The wood was wet, meaning the fires hissed and smoked, filling the small homes with a choking fog rather than warmth. And always overhead was the sound of the water. Drum, drum, drum. It was an endless, patient rhythm. The roads, which were nothing more than beaten earth, dissolved into impassable tracks of deep, clinging mud. Carts sank to their axles. Oxen struggled to pull the plows through the fields that had turned to swamps. The grain rotted in the earth. The barley molded on the stalk. The hay blackened in the meadows.
To understand why a summer of rain was a death sentence, you have to look at the fragile mathematics of a world that ate what it grew. Medieval Europe was an overwhelmingly agricultural society. The vast majority of the population lived in rural villages tied to the soil, their entire existence governed by the rhythm of the seasons. There were no global supply chains. There were no cargo ships carrying grain from across the ocean to make up for a local shortfall. The margin of survival was exactly as wide as the local harvest. The math was unforgiving. If a peasant family harvested a good crop, a portion of it had to be saved as seed corn for the following year. Another portion went to the church as a tithe. Another portion went to the lord of the manor as rent or tax. What remained was ground into flour for bread, or brewed into thin ale, or boiled into pottage. That was the entirety of the caloric foundation. It was a delicate, tightly balanced equation that relied on one crucial assumption, that the sun would shine. In a good year, the barns were full, and a tiny surplus might be carried over to the next. In a bad year, the surplus was eaten, the belts were tightened, and the village suffered through the lean months of spring until the new harvest came in. But a bad year was survivable. The terrible danger of 1315 was not just the failure of a single harvest. It was the absolute, catastrophic disruption of the entire agricultural cycle. If the sky turned against you, there was nowhere else to go. You belonged to the harvest now. And the rain was disrupting everything. The first casualty was the hay. In the medieval agricultural calendar, hay was life. Grass had to be cut in the summer and left to dry in the hot sun.
This dried hay was the only thing that would keep the livestock, the plow oxen, the milk cows, the sheep that provided wool, alive through the freezing winter. But in the summer of 1315, the sun did not shine. The cut grass lay in the waterlogged meadows and began to ferment. It turned into black, slimy, rotting piles. Without hay, the animals would starve. Without animals, there would be no manure to fertilize the fields and no oxen to plow the plows for the next year's planting. The rain was not just destroying the present harvest, it was actively unmaking the future. The sheer scale of the weather anomaly was something no living person had ever witnessed. This was not a localized storm. It was a massive, stagnant weather system that settled over the entirety of northern Europe. It fell on the rich, muddy plains of Flanders. It fell on the vineyards of France, where the grapes split and molded on the vines. It fell on the great river valleys of the Rhine and the Thames, causing them to burst their banks and carry away entire villages, mills, and bridges in the surging floodwaters. From the towering peaks of the Alps, stretching northward all the way to Scandinavia, the continent was drowning.
The slowness of it all was the true terror. A village does not starve in a week. A family does not waste away in a month. When the autumn of 1315 arrived and the harvest was brought in, it was a fraction of what was needed. The grain that had survived the rain was wet, soft, and difficult to mill. But the people did not immediately fall down in the mud. They looked at the empty bins in the granary, and they understood exactly what the long winter would bring. They began to ration. They began to forage. They settled in for the dark. The Great Famine did not announce itself with a blade. It did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. For the people standing under that weeping sky, the rain was a terrifying mystery. They watched the clouds with a growing, quiet dread. Johannes de Trocolo and his brother monks at St Albans fell to their knees in the damp chapel, listening to the rain drumming against the leaded roof, and they prayed. They believed with absolute certainty that they were being punished. They believed that the sins of humanity had finally grown too heavy, and that God had locked the gates of heaven, leaving the world to wash away in the deluge. From today's view, we possess a different vocabulary for the catastrophe. Paleoclimatologists studying the dense, narrow rings of ancient oak trees and the chemical composition of glacial ice cores can see exactly what was happening in the atmosphere of 1315. They do not see the wrath of God. They see the violent, shuddering end of an era. For 3 centuries before the rain began, Europe had basked in what modern science calls the medieval warm period. The climate had been unusually mild. The summers were long, the winters were gentle, and the harvests were consistently abundant. Under those warm skies, the population of Europe had exploded, reaching a demographic peak that the continent would not see again until the 18th century. Every scrap of arable land was cultivated. The forests were cleared, the swamps were drained, and the hillsides were terraced. The world was full. But the climate is never static. In the early years of the 14th century, the warming engine simply stalled. The atmospheric circulation shifted. The Atlantic brought relentless, unseasonal storms, heralding the beginning of a centuries-long cooling phase that historians sometimes call the Little Ice Age. The rain of 1315 was the turning point, a climactic anomaly of staggering proportions, striking a population that had expanded to the absolute limits of its food supply. From today's view, it was a localized weather event meeting an unsustainable demographic peak. From their view, the sky had broken and God had turned his face away from the fields. And that's what's so chilling.
Winchester, England, 1316.
A manorial clerk in the service of the Bishop of Winchester takes up a quill, dips it in iron gall ink, and writes a series of Roman numerals on a long roll of parchment. This document, the Winchester Pipe Roll, will outlive him, quietly preserving the exact mathematics of a catastrophe. Listen to what the numbers say. In a normal year, the bishop's estates operated on a simple, vital ratio. For every bushel of wheat sown into the earth returned 4. But in the wet years, the clerk recorded a different number. For every bushel sown, the field returned barely 1.5. He wrote it down because it was his job to track the wealth of the manor. He recorded the empty barns. He recorded the missing sheaves. And the worst part isn't the ink or the parchment or the dismal fraction of a harvest. The worst part is what that fraction meant. A world that eats its own seed to survive the winter has already lost the next year before it begins. To understand how the famine tightened its grip, we have to look past the rain and into the dirt. We have to walk the machinery of the medieval food system and watch it break, piece by piece, from the ground up. In the early 13th century, grain was not simply one food among many. It was the foundation upon which the entire architecture of human society stood. The castles, the cathedrals, the armies, the bustling markets of London and Paris, all of it rested on a few inches of topsoil and a thin green stalk of wheat. The diet of the medieval world was overwhelmingly built on cereal crops. It was wheat for the white bread of the lords. It was barley for the heavy, dark bread and the thin ale of the peasants. It was rye for the poorest fields, and oats for the horses. Bread was not a side dish, it was the meal. A working adult in the 14th century consumed as much as 2 or 3 pounds of bread a day, often supplemented only by a thick boiled porridge called pottage, made from dried peas, beans, and whatever grain could be swept from the threshing floor. Because the entire society ran on grain, it ran on a remarkably thin margin. The logic of subsistence farming is a fragile equation. When the harvest comes in, you cannot eat it all. You must immediately divide it. A tenth goes to the church, a portion goes to the lord of the manor. Another large portion, often a quarter to a third of the entire crop, must be carefully locked away in the granary, untouched, to serve as the seed corn for the next year's planting. Only what remains after all these deductions can be ground into flour. You sow 1, you reap 3 or 4, you eat 1, and you save 1 to start again. When the relentless rains of 1315 fell, they dismantled this equation with a terrifying patience. The wheat failed, the barley failed, and then the rye. The harvest of 1315 was not merely small, it was physically ruined. As the time for reaping approached in late summer, the fields were swamps of clinging clay. The reapers waded ankle-deep in mud, trying to cut stalks that were already blackening and rotting at the base. Grain must be dry to be harvested, but the rain on the thatch simply would not stop. Drum, 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 and beneath it a new and terrible silence began to fall over the countryside. Usually the weeks of harvest were a time of deafening noise and frantic activity. The threshing floors rang with the sound of wooden flails beating the grain from the chaff. The heavy stone wheels of the watermills turned day and night, grinding the dry kernels into fine, pale flour. But in the autumn of 1315, the mill wheels were still. There was nothing to grind. The sheaves of wheat and barley that were dragged from the wet fields would not dry.
Left in the damp barns, they began to ferment. A fungus, ergot, bloomed on the damp rye. Some peasants tried to dry the wet sheaves in their small baking ovens, desperate to salvage something, but the grain was often too soft, too spoiled, dissolving into a gray, foul-smelling paste rather than milling into powder. This was the first failure. It was hard, but it was survivable. The granaries still held a little reserve from the good years before. But the famine was not a sudden blow. It did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. The true catastrophe of the Great Famine was the harvest of 1316. When the spring of 1316 arrived, the peasantry faced a desperate, impossible choice. The winter had been long and hungry. The reserves were gone. The children were crying in the dark, their faces hollow, their bodies slowing down. But in the granary sat the seed corn, the grain saved from the ruined harvest of 1315, waiting to be planted. To a medieval farmer, eating the seed was a violation of the most fundamental law of survival. It was a line you did not cross. If you ate the seed, you were eating the future. You were ensuring that even if the sun came out, your field would remain barren. But hunger has a terrible, crushing weight. It breaks down the future into the immediate, agonizing present. You look at a starving child, and you look at a sack of barley, and the arithmetic of next year ceases to matter. And so, quietly, across northern Europe, the granary doors were opened. The seed was eaten. When the time came to plant the fields for the 1316 harvest, the seed was severely depleted. What little they did sow was of poor quality, weakened by the rot of the previous year, and the ground was still wet. The rain had returned. The seed went into waterlogged furrows, where much of it simply drowned before it could sprout. The harvest of 1316 was even smaller than the disaster of 1315. The fields were thinning. The granary stood open and gave nothing. You belonged to the harvest, and the harvest was dying.
And then, as if the rotting crops were not enough, the wet earth came for the animals. A medieval farm could not function without its beasts. The heavy wheeled plows required to turn the dense clay soils of northern Europe were pulled by teams of massive oxen. Without them, the earth could not be broken. Sheep provided the wool that clothed the population and fueled the vital medieval textile trade, while their manure was the only fertilizer that restored nutrients to the exhausted soil. Cows provided milk and cheese, a crucial source of protein when the grain failed. But the rain that drowned the wheat also drowned the pastures. The meadows turned to bogs, the grass soured, and the animals, standing in the cold wet, began to sicken. First came the sheep, a disease known as liver fluke, thriving in the waterlogged grass, swept through the flocks of England and the continent in 1315 and 1316. The manorial rolls, those careful ledgers of life and death, record staggering losses. Flocks reduced by half or 3/4, left to rot in the wet grass. Then, compounding the disaster, came the great murrain of cattle. A highly contagious panzootic, likely a strain of rinderpest, began to move across Europe. Though its heaviest blow would land slightly later, around 1319 and 1321, the early waves of sickness found a bovine population already weakened by the lack of winter hay. The oxen, the great engines of the medieval field, began to collapse in the mud. The dairy cows dried up and died. The loss of the animals mortgaged the recovery.
Without the oxen, the fields for 1317 could not be plowed deeply enough. Without the sheep and cattle, there was no manure to enrich the soil. The failure fed upon itself, a perfect, inescapable loop of decline. The field forgot how to grow. The buyer went quiet. This is how a civilization starves. It does not happen overnight. It happens when the first failure forces a compromise, and the compromise guarantees a second failure, and the second failure strips away the tools needed to rebuild. It was a slow, grinding machinery of absence. The manorial clerks, like the one in Winchester, kept writing it down. They filled their parchment rolls with tight columns of numbers, documenting a world that was quietly winding down, grain by grain, beast by beast. From today's view, this is a sequence of cascading ecological failures. We see saturated root systems, anaerobic soil conditions, the exhaustion of seed-to-yield ratios, and the vector-driven spread of zoonotic disease in a weakened livestock population. From their view, the machinery of the world had simply stopped. The earth had closed its hands, and it would not let them go. And that's what's so chilling.
Westminster, England, 1315. A royal clerk in the service of King Edward II takes up a pen and writes a proclamation that will be carried by riders into every market square in the realm. Listen to what he wrote. "We have ordained that a best fat ox, not fed on grain, be sold for 16 shillings, and no more. A fat sheep, unshorn, for 20 pence. He wrote it because the king and the barons assembled in Parliament were trying to build a wall of ink against a rising tide of hunger. He recorded the maximum price for a goose, a capon, a dozen eggs. And the worst part isn't the ink or the parchment or the desperate hope of the king's decree. The worst part is the silence that met the heralds when they read the words aloud in the rain. Because no law can command a harvest." To understand what the Great Famine was to the millions of people enduring it, you have to stand inside their minds. You have to look up at the gray sky and see it the way they saw it. They did not see a weather system. They did not see a climatic anomaly or a shifting atmospheric current. They saw a verdict. The rain was not falling on them. It was being sent. It was being sent by a God whose patience they had finally exhausted. And the only sane response to the anger of heaven was not to study the clouds, but to fall on your knees beneath them. The royal ordinance of 1315 was a perfectly logical attempt by earthly power to control an unraveling world. The decree was written on heavy parchment. It was sealed with wax. It was dispatched with the full, terrifying authority of the English crown. The point was simple. If the merchants were hoarding food to drive up the cost, the king would forcefully cap the market. The law dictated the price of cattle. It dictated the price of sheep. It set the exact value of a hen. But the ordinance was speaking to a world that no longer existed. By the time the king's sheriffs stood on wooden platforms and read the writ to the gathered crowds, there were no fat oxen left to sell. The sheep were already dying in the waterlogged pastures. The grain merchants were not simply hoarding wheat, they had no wheat to hoard. If a farmer did possess a small reserve, he refused to bring it to market where the king's low price would guarantee his own family's starvation. The food simply vanished, the markets emptied, the stalls stood bare. Edward II's attempt to legislate the famine away failed almost immediately, and within a year the crown quietly revoked it.
The failure of the king was a quiet, terrifying revelation. It proved to every peasant and every lord that earthly authority was entirely helpless. The king's men could not stop the rot in the sheaves. The local lord could not drain the flooded fields. The armed knights could not fight the sky.
When the power of the throne fails, a society looks to the power of the altar. In the medieval worldview, the universe was profoundly moral, and it was entirely coherent. Nothing in the natural world was an accident. The turning of the seasons, the sprouting of the seed, the warmth of the sun, these were active, daily gifts. And just as a good harvest was a sign of divine favor, a failing sky was a sign of divine wrath. When the rains began in the spring of 1315 and simply did not stop, the people of Northern Europe thought of the book of Genesis. They thought of the great flood that had once washed a sinful world clean. The monastic chroniclers recorded the disaster in exactly these terms. Johannes de Troclo, watching the fields drown around St Albans, did not write about agriculture. He wrote that the dearth was God's scourge. He wrote that it was sent to punish the pride and the wickedness of the people. Every chronicler from Ireland to the Rhineland wrote the same thing. The rotting grain was a physical manifestation of a rotting morality. The earth was vomiting out the seed because the people walking upon it were unclean. If the famine was a punishment, then the only way to survive it was through penance. And so, as the bread ran out, the roads of Europe filled with a desperate, deeply moving machinery of atonement. The primary weapon against the rain was the penitential procession. The bishops and archbishops issued strict orders. Entire villages turned out into the mud. They walked barefoot to show their absolute humility before God. They wore coarse, itchy hair shirts or simple garments of unbleached wool. They carried the heavy, gilded reliquaries holding the bones of their local saints, taking the sacred shrines out of the dry sanctuaries and carrying them under the weeping sky. The processions walked through the flooded streets. They walked around the boundaries of the rotting fields. They walked until their bare feet bled on the cold stones. The clergy led them, chanting the 7 penitential psalms, their voices thin and reedy in the damp air. They sang the litany of the saints, keeping time with their slow, deliberate footsteps. Imagine the sheer sensory reality of that moment, the smell of wet wool, the smoke of beeswax candles sputtering and dying in the downpour, the cold mud seeping between bare toes, the sight of hundreds of people, already stomachs gnawing with hunger, walking slowly through a landscape that was turning to sludge. They did not do this in a blind pack. They did it with a grim, ordered solemnity. It was a perfectly logical response to a theological crisis. You belonged to the harvest now, and above the harvest stood the God who controlled it, and his judgment had to be appeased. The cruelest irony of the medieval response was the mandate to fast. In order to show true repentance, the church ordered days of strict fasting. People who were already starving, who were already rationing crumbs of moldy bread, were instructed to willingly refuse what little food they had. They were also told to give alms. The belief was that charity could appease an angry heaven. The wealthy lords and the great monasteries were expected to open their gates and distribute food to the poor. The monks, bound by their vows of charity, handed out the last of their loaves, engaging in a terrifying arithmetic of spiritual insurance. They gave away their own survival, trusting that God would see the sacrifice and finally stop the rain. But God did not stop the rain. The barefoot processions returned to their damp, cold homes. The reliquaries were placed back on the altars. The church bells stopped their somber tolling. And overhead, the sound remained,
Drum, drum, drum. The rain on the thatch continued, washing away the prayers, washing away the fasting, washing away the hope. This was the true horror of the Great Famine. It did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. And to a people who believed they were enduring a divine punishment, the slowness of the famine was the purest proof of its cruelty. A sudden fire or a swift plague could be borne as a single terrible blow, but a punishment that stretched across the spring and the summer and the autumn, year after year, read as a heaven that simply would not relent. It was a long, slow crushing of hope, delivered drop by drop. From today's view, we see a fragile agrarian economy breaking under the weight of a severe climatic shift. We see a cooling atmosphere, a catastrophic collapse in crop yields, and an overlarge population meeting a failing food supply. From their view, they saw a world groaning under the weight of its own sins, and a God who had finally decided to watch it away. And that's what's so chilling.
St Albans Abbey, England, 1316. A monk named Johannes de Troclo sits in the cold, damp scriptorium, takes up a quill, and writes a passage in his Latin chronicle that will outlive him by 700 years. Listen to what he wrote. The poor and needy, oppressed by hunger, lay dead in the streets and squares. Such a dearth and famine appeared that the poor were consumed with hunger, and the living were hardly sufficient to bury the dead. He wrote it down because he was a historian of his house, keeping the annals of the abbey through a time when the world seemed to be ending. He recorded the flooded roads. He recorded the price of wheat. He recorded the bodies that nobody had the strength to move. And the worst part isn't the silence of the scriptorium, or the scratch of the quill on the parchment, or even the bodies in the street. The worst part is the terrible, quiet gap between the man holding the pen and the people he was writing about. Because Johannes de Troclo was not starving. Behind the high walls of St Albans, he had bread, and he was watching the people outside the gate waste away. To understand the emotional core of the Great Famine, you have to understand the silence of the archive. In the 14th century, history was written by the people who had access to parchment and ink and the education to use them. The vast, overwhelming majority of the people who suffered and died in the years of the reign left us absolutely nothing of their own. They left no diaries, they left no letters, they did not carve their names into stone memorials, and they did not paint their own grief. The medieval poor are, for the most part, a silent mass in the historical record, appearing only as numbers on a tax roll or a casualty estimate. But behind every single number in those staggering mortality figures, the 10 or 15% of Northern Europe that perished, there was a human being. There was a mother trying to dilute the last handful of barley flour with water to make a thin, gray broth for her children. There was a father walking out into the freezing mud of an empty field to look for edible roots. There was a person whose life mattered entirely to the people who loved them. And because they could not write, their suffering was in danger of disappearing completely the moment the earth closed over them. That is why the monk at St Albans matters so much. Johannes de Troclo, or the anonymous brothers working alongside him to compile the abbey's annals, did the one thing that could give the nameless dead a fraction of their dignity back. He watched them, and he wrote them down. The walls of St Albans Abbey were made of thick, heavy stone. The granaries were deep. The cellars held barrels of salted fish and wheels of hard cheese and the carefully guarded reserves of grain that a major religious house always kept.
The monks lived under the rule of Saint Benedict, an ordered life of prayer, work, and reading. Their environment was sealed. The cloister was walled. The gates were heavy oak bound in iron.
But a medieval abbey was not entirely cut off from the world. It was a center of the community, and crucially, it was a center of charity. The monks were obligated by their faith to distribute alms to the poor. As the harvest of 1315 failed, and the harvest of 1316 failed even worse, the road leading to the abbey gates became choked with the desperate. Imagine what Troclo and his brothers saw when they walked to the almonry. There were hundreds of people standing in the relentless rain. They were soaked through their coarse wool tunics. Their faces were hollow, the skin drawn tight over their cheekbones. They were begging for whatever the monks could spare: a crust of bread, a bowl of thin pottage, a handful of dried peas. And as the famine deepened, the monks themselves had less and less to give. The abbey's own stores were dwindling. The almoner had to turn people away, looking into the eyes of starving families and closing the heavy oak doors, knowing exactly what would happen to them on the road. This is the grief that bleeds through the Latin of the Annales. Troclo was a careful chronicler. He recorded the exact prices of the markets, how a quarter of wheat, which normally cost a few shillings, soared to 20, 30, and then 40 shillings. But he was also a human being, and his record is filled with a profound, helpless horror. He writes of the poor dying in the mud. He writes of disease sweeping through the weakened crowds. Famine does not usually kill its victims with pure starvation. Long before the body completely runs out of calories, the immune system collapses. The people gathered outside the gates of St Albans, sleeping in the wet ditches, eating garbage and rotting leaves, were decimated by opportunistic diseases: typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. Troclo called it a pestilence among men, a great mortality that followed the hunger. He watched them die, one by one, in the cold rain. The hardest thing for a compassionate witness to bear is a tragedy that refuses to end. If a fire burns through a village, it is a night of terror, but the next morning the survivors can begin to clear the ash. The Great Famine was a slow violence. It did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. For Troclo, sitting in the scriptorium, the horror was the sheer length of the catastrophe. He watched the rain fall in the spring of 1315. He watched the harvest rot. He saw the winter bring the first wave of true hunger. Then he watched the spring of 1316 arrive, bringing not relief, but more rain. He watched the seed corn run out. He watched the faces at the abbey gate grow thinner and fewer as the weakest stopped making the journey. Month after month, year after year, the catastrophe simply ground onward. If you were a peasant in that endless gray twilight, you would have watched the sky more closely than you had ever watched anything in your life. You would have looked for a break in the clouds, a shift in the wind, any sign that the world was returning to normal. But the sky remained sealed. You belonged to the harvest now, and the harvest had abandoned you. And for the monk watching from behind the wall, the helplessness was absolute. He could not stop the rain. He could not multiply the loaves. He could only listen to the sound outside his window. The rain on the thatch, the rain on the stone of the cloister, the rain on the mud of the road where the people were lying down and not getting back up. Drum, drum, drum. There is a deep, quiet nobility in the act of recording a tragedy you cannot stop. When Johannes de Troclo dipped his quill in the dark iron gall ink, he was performing an act of preservation. He was ensuring that the wealthy and the powerful would not be remembered the only ones.
The king's decrees had failed. The barons were retreating to their castles to guard their own supplies. The poor were left to die in the open. But because one monk in Hertfordshire could not look away, their suffering was made permanent. We do not know the names of the people who died outside the gates of St Albans. We do not know the name of the mother who buried her child in the wet earth, or the father who starved so his family could share his ration. But we know they existed. We know that they suffered, and we know that their suffering was seen and grieved by a man who shared their faith but not their fate. The parchment he wrote on was stretched calfskin. The words were Latin. The ink was dark and deliberate. He wrote down the flooded roads and the soaring prices and the bodies in the squares because he refused to let the years pass unrecorded. He built a small, quiet monument out of words, standing against the vast erasure of the famine. From today's view, the Chronicles of St Albans are a vital primary source, a data point that allows historians to map the economic and demographic collapse of the early 14th century. From their view, it was a vigil. It was a man keeping watch in the dark, writing down the end of the world so that someone, someday, might remember the people who did not survive it. And that's what's so chilling.
St Albans, England, 1316. The chronicler Johannes de Triclot sits at his desk, takes up a pen, and writes a single sentence about the market that will outlive him by 7 centuries. Listen to what he wrote. A quarter of wheat, which in the past was sold for 4 or 5 shillings, is now sold for 20 and even for 40 shillings. He wrote it down because it was a fact of the changing world around him. He recorded the silver pennies. He recorded the shifting weights. And the worst part isn't the inflation or the silver or the number 40. The worst part is what that number meant. You can measure the whole catastrophe in a single number. Not a death toll. Those came later and were much harder to count. A price. The price of a quarter of wheat, the grain a family lived on, which in an ordinary year cost a few shillings. In the worst of the famine, that same measure cost nearly 8 times as much. And a price is only a number, a quiet mark of ink on parchment, until you understand that on the other side of it was a mother deciding she could no longer afford to feed everyone at her table. Tonight, we are looking at a different kind of artifact. We are not looking at a ruined field or a drowning village. We are looking at a surviving manorial grain price roll. The parchment was sheepskin, scraped clean and cut into long, narrow strips, then stitched together end to end to form a continuous roll. The ink was made from crushed oak galls, iron salts, and water. The script was a tight, precise clerical shorthand. The point was simple. Every transaction on the manor, every purchase of seed, every sale of surplus grain had to be strictly accounted for. The roll sealed the history of the year. It went down column by column. It tallied the pounds. It tallied the shillings. It tallied the pence. And looking at those neat, dark numbers today, in the quiet of an archive, you can read the exact shape of the catastrophe. To understand the machinery of the famine, you have to understand that the medieval world was not entirely a barter economy. It was an economy of coins. While many peasants grew their own food, millions of people, laborers, artisans, roofers, ditch diggers, and the urban poor sold their labor for wages and used those wages to buy their bread. When the rains of 1315 rotted the harvest, the crisis did not just happen in the dirt, it happened in the purse. Consider the arithmetic of the silver penny. The standard coin of the realm in England was the silver penny, stamped with the face of the king. It was a tangible, physical piece of wealth, often cut into halves and quarters to make small change. A common laborer, working from sunrise to sunset, digging ditches or repairing thatch, might earn a penny and a half for a day of back-breaking work. In a normal, healthy year, before the rain, a quarter of wheat, a standard measure of volume equaling 8 bushels, or roughly 400 pounds of grain, cost about 5 shillings. Since there were 12 pence in a shilling, a quarter of wheat cost 60 pence. For a laborer earning a penny and a half a day, a quarter of wheat represented about 40 days of labor. It was a substantial investment, but it was entirely manageable. It was the foundation of a family's winter reserve. Then came the endless drumming rain. The harvest failed, the granaries emptied, and the price on the manorial roll began to climb. By the spring of 1316, the price of a quarter of wheat had doubled, reaching 10 shillings. By the summer, as the second harvest drowned in the fields, it reached 20, and by the darkest months of the crisis, in places like St Albans and the markets of London, it touched 40 shillings, 480 silver pence. The math was absolute. The laborer was still standing in the rain, digging the ditch, earning his penny and a half a day. His wage had not gone up, but the grain he needed to survive now cost over 300 days of labor. He had been priced out of his own survival. The price didn't strike him down with a sword. It simply rose and waited and let the arithmetic do the rest. This terrifying gap between the cost of food and the means to buy it played out most visibly at the baker's stall. In medieval towns, the price of a loaf of bread was strictly regulated by a law called the assize of bread and ale. The law was designed to protect the poor, and it operated on a fascinating principle. The price of a loaf never changed. A penny loaf always cost 1 penny. What changed was the weight of the loaf. The local bailiffs would check the baker's scales to ensure the weight corresponded to the current market price of wheat. In a good year, a penny bought a heavy, dense loaf of bread, large enough to sustain a working man for the entire day. But as the price of wheat climbed to 20, 30, and 40 shillings, the penny loaf physically shrank. You would walk into the market holding the same cold silver coin you had held the year before. You would hand it to the baker, and the baker would place in your palm a piece of bread the size of a small apple. It was a quiet, visual horror. The coin was the same, the silver was the same, but the food had simply vanished into the air. As the bread shrank, the market went into reverse. When wages cannot pay for food, people begin to sell everything else they own. The famine became a massive, quiet transfer of wealth. Imagine the market square in a medieval town in the autumn of 1316. The rain on the thatch of the market hall keeps up its patient, relentless rhythm. Drum, drum, drum. Under the eaves, the stalls where grain and meat used to be sold are empty. Instead, the square is filled with the poorest people of the surrounding villages, bringing everything they have left in the world, trying to turn it into silver. They brought the tools of their survival. They brought the iron-tipped spades that were meant to turn the earth. They brought the heavy copper cooking pots that had hung over the hearth fire for generations. They brought their winter cloaks, made of thick, oiled wool, and laid them out in the damp air. They sold them to the pawnbrokers or to the wealthy few who still had surplus coin. They sold them for fractions of their true value, because a copper pot is useless if there is nothing to put inside it. They sold their animals. The plow ox was led to the butcher,
not for breeding or for labor, but for a few shillings to buy wheat. When the ox was sold, the family lost the ability to plow their field for the next year. They were eating their own future. And finally, they sold the land itself. The manorial records from the famine years showed a massive spike in land transfers. Desperate peasant families, staring at an empty granary and starving children, sold their small strips of inherited land to their wealthier neighbors. The men who had hoarded grain or who had deep reserves of silver bought up the village fields for a pittance. The famine stripped the poor of the very earth they lived on. Even if the rain stopped, they would have no field to return to. You belonged to the harvest now, and the harvest had taken your home. This was the economic reality that King Edward II had tried and failed to stop with his ordinance of 1315. The king had looked at the soaring prices and tried to ban them by royal decree, capping the cost of oxen, sheep, and poultry. But the king's ink could not conjure a harvest. When the crown commanded that a fat ox be sold for 16 shillings, the merchants simply stopped bringing oxen to the market. The fixed price failed because the economy of the famine was not driven by greed alone. It was driven by absolute physical absence. There was simply no food. And the price found its own terrible level, regardless of the crown. The Great Famine did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. It waited in the ledgers of the manorial clerks. It waited on the baker's wooden scales. It waited in the cold exchange of a heavy wool cloak for a handful of copper coins. The suffering of 1316 was not a chaotic riot of starving mobs. It was an ordered, bureaucratic descent into ruin. The clerks kept writing. The bailiffs kept weighing. The laws of supply and demand functioned with a flawless, psychopathic perfection, pricing millions of people out of the right to draw breath. From today's view, this is a crisis of supply and inelastic demand, a classic inflationary shock recorded in the ledgers of a medieval economy. From their view, it was the arithmetic of starvation, written in silver and sealed in wax. And that's what's so chilling.
Malmesbury, England, 1316. An anonymous monk inside the great abbey takes up his pen to record the state of the world beyond his walls. And he writes a sentence that strips away everything we think we know about starvation. Listen to what he wrote. "The poor and the needy, having no other provision, fed upon the roots of the earth and the bark of trees, and on things not fit for human use." He wrote it down because the people he was watching had run out of grain. He recorded the stripping of the forests. He recorded the foraging in the wet dirt. And the worst part isn't the roots or the bark or the desperate scavenging in the rain. The worst part is what that scavenging actually meant. We have a tendency to picture famine as a passive tragedy. We imagine an empty larder and a people who simply sit down, weaken, and quietly wait for the end. But hunger is not a passive thing. A starving people does not simply wait. It searches, it digs, it grinds tree bark into flour, and it boils grass into soup, and it strips the hedgerows bare, and it goes on searching long after there is anything left worth finding. The story of what the hungry ate during the Great Famine is not a story of emptiness. It is a story of a terrible, desperate ingenuity. It is the story of millions of people who turned to a second, hidden larder that the good years never touched, trying everything the earth held before they would finally give up. To understand the famine diet, you have to look at the anatomy of a medieval loaf of bread. In a prosperous year,
The hierarchy of bread was absolute. At the top was pandemain, the fine white bread of the nobility, made from wheat flour sifted multiple times through linen cloth to remove every trace of bran. Below that was the bread of the common people, made from maslin, a reliable mixture of wheat and rye. Below that was the heavy, dark bread of the poorest peasants, baked from barley, oats, and the bran left over from the Lord's sifted flour. But by the winter of 1316, the wheat was gone, the rye was ruined, the oats had failed, and the medieval loaf began to devolve, step by step, into something that was barely bread at all. When the flour ran out, the bakers and the mothers of the village turned to the refuse of the threshing floor. They swept up the chaff, the dry, scaly protective casings of the grain that were usually thrown to the pigs or burned as fuel. They took dried peas and beans, usually reserved for boiling into pottage, and ground them into a hard, gritty powder to add weight to the dough.
When the peas and the chaff ran out, they turned to the forest. In a normal medieval autumn, the forests were vital grazing grounds for livestock. Pigs were driven into the woods to gorge on mast, the rich carpet of fallen acorns and beech nuts. But in 1316, the humans competed with the pigs. People gathered the acorns by the sackful. You cannot simply eat an acorn. It is dangerously high in tannic acid, which makes it incredibly bitter and toxic to the human digestive system. The famine foragers knew this. They shelled the acorns, crushed them, and soaked them in running streams for days to leach out the tannins. Then they dried the nut meat over their smoky, damp hearths, ground it into flour, and baked it into a dense, bitter, heavy bread. When the acorns ran out, they ate the trees themselves. The chroniclers of the Great Famine repeatedly mention the poor eating the bark of trees. They were not eating the rough, woody exterior. They were harvesting the cambium, the thin, pale inner layer of bark that sits between the hard wood and the outer crust. The cambium of birch, elm, and pine contained trace amounts of digestible starches. In the freezing rain, men and women walked into the woods with iron knives and stripped the trunks bare. They took the pale strips of inner bark, dried them until they were brittle, and pulverized them under heavy stones. The resulting powder was mixed with a little water, perhaps a handful of bran, if any remained, and baked. The bark bread did not rise. It was heavy, dark, and tasted of sawdust and resin. It filled the stomach, creating a brief, desperate illusion of fullness, but it provided almost no caloric value. When they were not baking bark, they were boiling the hedgerows. The standard peasant meal of the Middle Ages was pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew. In the famine years, the pottage pot contained no barley and no bacon fat. Instead, the women and children were sent out into the relentless drumming rain to scour the edges of the fields and the banks of the flooded streams. The sound of 1316 was the rain on the thatch and the rain on the wool cloaks of the foragers, bending over the wet earth. Drum, drum, drum. They gathered stinging nettles. They gathered dandelions and mallow and wild garlic and ferns. They dug for the tuberous roots of waterdropwort and wild carrots. They took these weeds back to the dark, smoky cottages and boiled them for hours, breaking down the tough cellulose into a thin, green, watery sludge. There is a profound dignity in this foraging. The knowledge of wild and marginal foods was not written in any university manuscript. It was a hard, inherited wisdom passed down from mother to daughter, preserved in the collective memory of the village for exactly such years.
In the midst of the crisis, neighbors shared this knowledge. They showed one another where the edible roots still grew. They shared the use of a dry oven. It was a small, quiet mercy in a world that had forgotten how to be merciful. The poor did not simply surrender to the rain. They met an impossible situation with every ounce of resourcefulness they possessed. But ingenuity had a terrifying limit. As the winter of 1316 deepened into 1317, the wild larder was stripped bare. The hedgerows were empty, the bark was gone, and the terrible arithmetic of the farm returned. In Chapter 2, we saw the awful logic of the seed corn, the grain saved for next year's planting, eaten out of sheer desperation. As the famine ground on, that same logic came for the animals. A medieval peasant family did not eat meat very often. Their animals were far too valuable alive. A sheep was a source of wool and milk. An ox was the engine that pulled the plow. A hen provided a steady stream of eggs. To slaughter a draft animal or a breeding ewe was to commit agricultural suicide. It was the absolute last resort, a line crossed only when the children were actively fading away. But as the bark bread failed to sustain them and the green pottage left them hollow and cramping, the lines were crossed. The remaining sheep, those that had not already died in the wet pastures from liver fluke, were butchered. The plow oxen, already weak and starving themselves, were slaughtered and boiled, their tough, stringy meat rationed out over weeks. They cracked the bones to boil the marrow. They ate the farm dogs. They ate the cats. Every animal eaten was a mortgage on the future. Without the ox, the field could not be plowed when the spring finally came. Without the sheep, there would be no wool to sell for silver. The famine ate not just the present, but the years that were supposed to follow. And the cruelest truth of the famine diet was that it did not actually save them. The substitutions, the bark, the acorns, the boiled weeds, the spoiled meat, kept the stomach from feeling entirely empty, but they could not keep the body alive. The human digestive system is not built to extract calories from cellulose and tree bark. The famine foods caused severe, agonizing stomach cramps. The gritty chaff and the stone-ground roots wore down the enamel of their teeth. And while they chewed on the heavy, dark bread, their bodies were quietly, methodically starving. The lack of protein and essential vitamins caused their immune systems to collapse. Their limbs swelled with edema. Their skin took on a gray, translucent pallor. The famine diet did not stop the dying. It merely prolonged it. The weeds and the bark bought them a few more weeks of life, a little more time to wait in the rain, hoping for a harvest that was never going to come.
It did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. The famine waited in the woods while the bark was stripped. It waited by the river while the acorns were leached. It watched a mother feed her child a bowl of boiled nettles, knowing that the nettles were not enough. We look back at these lists of famine foods, and it is easy to feel a kind of detached, clinical horror. But the bark bread and the wild roots are not symbols of degradation. They are the physical evidence of a people who refused to die quietly. They were bound to a broken earth. You belonged to the harvest now, and when the harvest vanished, you belonged to the woods and the weeds and the roots in the mud. You belonged to whatever the land would still give, even when it gave almost nothing. From today's view, this is a catalogue of extreme caloric deficit and physiological breakdown, the predictable foraging patterns of a subsistence culture in terminal distress.
From their view, it was the final, desperate struggle to wring life out of a world that had turned to water. And that's what's so chilling.
Hampshire, England, 1316. An auditor for the great estates of the Bishop of Winchester takes up his pen and writes a column of numbers in the manorial roll that reveals the quietest, coldest truth of the famine years. Listen to what the numbers say. In the very worst months of the dearth, while the roads were choked with the starving, the bishop's manors were still selling wheat. They were selling the surplus of the good years, unlocked from the vast stone granaries of the estate, and they were selling it at the new astronomical market price of 20 and sometimes 30 shillings a quarter. He wrote it down because it was his duty to track the wealth of the diocese. He recorded the quarters of grain sold. He recorded the soaring profits. And the worst part isn't the silver, or the profit, or the heavy iron lock on the granary door. The worst part is the cottage sitting less than a mile down the road. We remember the Great Famine as a catastrophe that happened to everyone, and in a sense it was. The sky did not discriminate. The rain fell on the rich, dark soils of the Lord's private fields exactly as it fell on the narrow, stony strips of the peasant. But hunger has always run downhill. In these years, as in every year, there were tables in the land with bread still on them, sitting behind the thick walls of the manor house and the abbey, a mile and a whole world away from the cottage where the shelf was bare. The famine did not undo the social order of the medieval world. If anything, it perfectly and ruthlessly revealed it. Tonight, we are walking away from the muddy roads and the desperate foraging in the woods. We are walking through the quiet, ordinary geography of inequality. The medieval world was built on a rigid, unyielding hierarchy, shaped like a vast pyramid. At the very bottom were the landless laborers, the cottagers and the small tenant farmers, living hand to mouth on whatever the earth provided that season. Above them were the wealthier peasants, with larger land holdings. Above them were the local lords, the knights, the barons, and the great monastic houses. And at the very top was the king. When the rains began in the spring of 1315, they fell on every tier of this pyramid. The sound of the famine was the rain on the thatch, and it fell with the same patient, indifferent rhythm on the roof of the manor as it did on the roof of the smallest mud and wattle hut. Drum, drum, drum. It was a gentle, almost lulling sound if you were inside by a warm fire, and a death knell if you were not. But the water did not pool evenly, and neither did the starvation. The Great Famine was a masterpiece of unequal distribution. For the poorest laborers, the crisis arrived almost immediately. Within months of the first failed harvest, their small reserves were gone. They had no coin to buy grain at the inflated market prices. For them, the old phrase held absolute, terrifying sway. You belonged to the harvest now, and the harvest had failed utterly. But as you moved up the social ladder, that belonging changed. The wealthy belonged to the harvest only at a distance. They had cushions of wealth, of stored food, of political power that absorbed the shock. The famine did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait, and it waited longest and took the most among those who had the least to begin with. Consider the architecture of the manorial estate. At the center of the village stood the Lord's house, surrounded by its outbuildings. The most important of these was the granary. The Lord's granary was not a simple wooden bin. It was built of heavy stone or thick oak timbers. It was raised off the ground on stattle stones, mushroom-shaped pillars of carved rock, to keep out the damp earth and the rats. It was sealed against the weather. It was locked with heavy iron keys. The manorial system was designed to funnel wealth upward. A peasant owed the lord a portion of their own crop as rent, and they also owed their labor, working the lord's private fields, the demesne, for a set number of days each week. In the good years, this meant the lord accumulated massive stores of surplus grain. In the bad years of 1315 and 1316, the lord's fields flooded just like everyone else's. But the lord did not immediately starve, because the heavy iron locks of the granary protected the surplus of the years before. The lord's hall remained warm. The hearth fires burned thick, dry logs cut from the private forests, where the peasants were forbidden to gather wood. There was salted venison in the cellars, and eels trapped in the mill pond, and wheels of hard cheese, and barrels of wine imported from Gascony. The lord's family ate bread, perhaps slightly darker bread than usual, perhaps rationed slightly more carefully by the steward, but bread nonetheless. The sheer economic advantage of this position was staggering. While the poor were boiling weeds, some lords and wealthy landholders were actively profiting from the disaster. They watched the price of a quarter of wheat climb to 20, 30, 40 shillings, and they ordered their bailiffs to sell their surplus on the open market. They took in massive sums of silver, and with that silver, as we saw in the market records, they bought up the distressed lands of the starving peasantry for pennies on the pound. The clerks sat in the warm, dry manor halls, writing down the transfer of deeds. The rich grew richer, acquiring new fields and consolidating their holdings, while the people who had farmed that land for generations walked away into the rain. But the picture of authority in the famine years was not uniformly cruel. It was deeply, uncomfortably mixed, and nowhere was this more apparent at the gates of the great monasteries. The medieval abbeys were a paradox. On one hand, they were vast, immensely wealthy corporations. Orders like the Cistercians and the Benedictines owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land, running massive flocks of sheep and operating enormous tithe barns that dwarfed the local lords' granaries. Like the lords, the abbeys had deep reserves, and like the lords, they were cushioned from the immediate blow of the rotting harvest.
But unlike a secular lord, a monastery was bound by the sacred rule of Saint Benedict. The monks were sworn to hospitality and charity. The poor who gathered at the abbey gates were not just hungry bodies. They were, in the theology of the time, the physical representatives of Christ himself. This created a profound, agonizing tension. As the famine deepened, the crowds outside the monastic almaries swelled to unmanageable numbers. The monks handed out the daily alms. They baked loaves of coarse bread specifically for the poor. They distributed the leftovers from the monks' own tables, passing wooden bowls of pottage through the heavy gatehouse doors. This act of almsgiving was a lifeline, a vital, pulsing artery of charity in a hardening world, and it is a small mercy we will return to later in the night. But an abbey was still an institution, and institutions are designed to survive. As 1316 dragged into 1317, the monks looked at their own dwindling granaries. They had to feed the brethren. They had to maintain the endless cycle of prayer. And so the almoners began to make impossible choices. They reduced the size of the alms loaves. They began to turn people away. The abbey remained an island of survival, but the waters of the famine were rising fast against its stone walls, and the monks could not pull everyone inside. The true tragedy of this unequal distribution was what it did to the invisible bonds that held a community together. In an ordinary year, a medieval village survived through a dense network of mutual obligation. If your plow broke, your neighbor lent you his. If your crop was light, your cousin shared their flour. You survived because the village survived. But famine is the ultimate isolating force. As the shelves went bare, the bonds of neighborliness quietly dissolved. It did not happen with riots or open violence in the village lanes. It happened with a slow, terrible quietness. A man with a small hidden sack of oats stopped inviting his neighbors to sit by his fire, lest they see it. A woman who had managed to forage a handful of edible roots hurried past her starving sister's door, looking at the ground. The obligations of charity, of kinship, of simple human decency were crushed under the sheer, grinding weight of caloric deficit. The door was closed, gently, and the wooden latch was dropped. The neighbor pretended not to hear the soft knocking on the other side. There is an eerie, humming stillness to this phase of the catastrophe. The society did not invert. The peasants did not rise up, storm the castles, and tear open the granaries by force. They were too weak, too exhausted, and too deeply conditioned by the divine hierarchy of their world. They simply endured it. The Lord ate in the hall. The monk prayed in the choir. The laborer starved in the ditch. The social architecture held perfectly firm, even as the people within it wasted away to nothing. From today's view, this is a textbook study in differential vulnerability, a demonstration of how extreme economic stratification dictates survival during a profound resource shock. From their view, it was simply the way the world was built, holding its shape even as the sky fell in. And that's what's so chilling.
Ypres, Flanders, 1316. An alderman of the city takes up a pen and writes a column of numbers in the municipal accounts that will outlive him by 700 years. Listen to what he wrote. He did not write names. He wrote the cost of shovels. He wrote that between the month of May and the month of November, the city paid to bury 2,794 paupers in the hospital cemetery. He wrote it down because someone had to pay the gravediggers. He recorded the silver spent. He recorded the mass graves dug in the wet earth. And the worst part isn't the silver, or the shovels, or the nearly 3,000 bodies. The worst part is what those numbers replaced. In a normal year, the death of a human being was a named communal event. The priest recorded who had died and who they left behind. But by 1316, the dying was general. It did not come in a single terrifying stroke, the way the plague would a generation later. It came slowly, quietly, a thinning of the living that went on for so long it began to seem like the ordinary state of the world. The chronicles stopped giving names. They begin giving numbers. And in the worst of it, in the places hardest hit, they record a thing the writers could barely bring themselves to set down. A thing I will name once, just as they did, and then leave where it lies. Tonight, we walk into the quietest and hardest part of the catastrophe. We walk into the empty village, and we look at the mark the famine left behind. The mortality of the Great Famine is difficult to count precisely because the poorest people left the lightest footprints in the archival record. But modern historians, looking at the manorial rolls, the Harriet taxes paid when a tenant died, and the municipal accounts of cities like Ypres, estimate that in the worst-hit regions of Northern Europe, something between 10 and 15% of the population perished. Millions of people. They did not die in a dramatic collapse. They died in the ditches by the side of the flooded roads.
They died in the damp corners of their unheated cottages. They died outside the heavy oak dates of the monasteries, waiting for alms that had finally run out. Famine usually kills through the diseases of malnutrition, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, which sweep through a weakened population with a terrifying ease. It was a slow, grinding attrition. It did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. And its patience was its cruelty, taking its toll a little at a time, month after month, until the numbers in the chronicles grew so large they lost their meaning. And as the people died, the animals followed. Just as the worst of the human starvation was unfolding, the second blow landed. We saw the beginning of this in chapter 2, with the sheep dying in the flooded pastures. But the true catastrophe for the livestock arrived slightly later, around 1319, and burned through the countryside until 1321. A massive cattle panzootic, a highly contagious plague, likely a strain of rinderpest, swept across the continent and into England.
The murrain took the oxen. It took the dairy cows. It took the breeding bulls. The manorial records showed death rates among cattle reaching 60, 70, and even 80% in some regions. The loss of the beasts meant that even if the sky cleared, the fields could not be plowed, the harvest could not be hauled, the land could not be fertilized. The disaster was absolute, taking the herds exactly as it had taken the harvest, paralyzing the machinery of recovery just as it might have begun. The byres were still, the pastures were empty. But the most devastating arithmetic of the famine was not played out in the fields or the cattle stalls. It was played out inside the family. When a household had only enough coarse bark bread to keep 2 people alive, and there were 5 sitting at the cold hearth, the bonds of blood began to fray. We know from the quietest and hardest entries in the historical record that the elderly often died first, quietly refusing their share of the dark, gritty pottage so that the younger generation might survive. The grandparents starved so the children could eat. But eventually, even that sacrifice was not enough. The records of the period hint at the profound, unspeakable anguish around the children. When a mother and a father could no longer produce food and their own bodies were shutting down, they faced an impossible threshold. Children were abandoned. They were left at the doors of the local churches or on the roads leading to the wealthy abbeys, in the desperate, fading hope that someone with a deeper granary might find them and take them in. The parents set them down, turned around, and walked away into the rain. You belonged to the harvest now, and when the harvest failed, those who belonged to it wholly, the poor, the landless, the children, paid with everything they had. There is one final thing the chronicles record. In the very worst of the famine, in the most isolated and devastated regions, the monastic annals report that the starving consumed the dead. I name it here because it stands as the absolute floor of human desperation, a testament to what a body will do when it is entirely empty. Its true extent is deeply uncertain. Many historians read these accounts not as widespread verified fact, but as the darkest kind of rumor, the way a traumatized society expresses the outer limits of its own horror. It was assuredly exceptionally rare, not a general practice, but the fact that it was written down at all, that it was believed possible by the men holding the pens, tells us exactly what kind of edge the world was standing on. We name it to honor the absolute extremity of their suffering, correct the lurid myths, and then we pass onward. We pass onward because the rain did eventually stop. The harvest of 1317 was slightly better. The grain was still scarce and the prices were still agonizingly high, but the sheer, unbroken failure of the previous 2 years had cracked.
By 1318, the weather patterns began to normalize. The sun broke through the heavy slate-gray clouds. The mud dried. The surviving peasants, those who still had a strip of land and the strength to hold a spade, went back into the fields. The sound of the rain on the thatch finally ceased, replaced by the profound, ringing silence of a world that had been emptied out. But the world the sun shone down on was not the same. The Great Famine left behind a population fundamentally altered. The people who survived 1315 to 1317 were forever marked by it. The children who lived through the starvation grew up with stunted bone development and compromised immune systems. Their bodies had learned to hoard every calorie, their biology permanently stressed by the years of bark bread and boiled weeds. The population was worn thin, its resilience deeply eroded. The social fabric had been tested to the absolute limit of its endurance. 30 years later, the children who had survived the Great Famine were adults in their 30s and 40s. They were the laborers, the mothers, the tradesmen, and the priests of Europe. And it was this exact generation, carrying the biological scars of the Great Starvation in their bones, that looked up in 1348 and saw a new, darker shadow moving across the continent. The famine did not cause the Black Death, but it prepared the ground. It weakened the walls. It ensured that when Yersinia pestis arrived in the crowded, muddy towns of northern Europe, it found a population that had already been hollowed out from the inside. From today's view, this is a demographic contraction, a severe mortality event, creating a biologically compromised cohort that would soon face a second, greater, catastrophic shock. From their view, it was a world that had survived the wrath of God, only to realize the hardest years were still to come. And that's what's so chilling.
Canterbury, England, 1316. The almoner of Christ Church Priory, a monk wrapped heavily against the damp, takes up a heavy iron ring of keys and walks toward the great oak doors of the abbey gatehouse. He writes nothing down, but the ledger of his house will remember what he did. Listen to what the record says. In a year when the harvest had failed utterly, and the priory's own massive stone granaries were strained to their very limits, the monks did not bar the gate. They baked loaves of coarse, heavy bread, made from whatever grain they could scrape from the floor of the barns, and they carried it to the boundary between the quiet cloister and the desperate world. The almoner turned the key. He pulled the heavy iron handle. And the worst part of the famine, the cold, the wet, the terrible isolation of the starving, was met for a brief and vital moment by the simplest and oldest kindness in the world. There were tables in the land with bread still on them, and sometimes a piece of that bread was handed to a stranger. Tonight we have walked a very long way through the dark. We have stood in the endless drumming rain of 1315. We have watched the fields rot and the prices climb and the granaries empty. We have looked at the absolute floor of human desperation, where the numbers replaced the names. But a catastrophe is rarely a monolith of pure suffering. Even in the darkest years of the early 14th century, the world did not entirely break. It bent, and it frayed, and it tore, but in small, quiet ways, it held together. Before we look at the world the famine left behind, we are going to look at 3 small mercies that lived inside the rain. 3 ways that the people of the 14th century endured and fed each other, and finally came out the other side. The first mercy was the bread at the gate. In Chapter 7, we saw the profound inequality of the famine, how the wealthy retreated behind the walls of their manors and locked their granaries. But the monastic houses, despite their vast wealth and their own dwindling stores, were bound by the law older and deeper than the manorial system.
They were bound by the rule of Saint Benedict and by the ancient Christian duty of charity. The poor who gathered in the mud outside the abbey walls were not an invading army to be driven off. They were the physical representatives of Christ, and to turn them away was to endanger the soul of the monastery itself. And so the gates opened. It was not a perfect charity, because no charity could match the scale of the failure. The abbeys could not feed everyone, and as the crisis deepened into the terrible winter of 1316 and the hungry spring of 1317, the almoners were forced to make agonizing choices. The loaves they handed out grew smaller. The pottage boiled in the great copper cauldrons grew thinner. But the profound mercy was that the gates continued to open at all. Across England, France, and Flanders, in wealthy, soaring priories, and in small, quiet parish churches, the clergy handed out food to people they did not know.
Imagine the sensory reality of that act. Imagine standing in the freezing rain, your wool tunic soaked completely through, your body hollow and shaking with the deep, aching cold of prolonged hunger. And then the heavy wooden door swings inward. You smell it before you see it, the faint, warm, miraculous scent of baking bread drifting out from the abbey kitchens. A monk in a rough, dark habit steps forward into the gray light. He does not ask for silver. He does not ask for your labor. He places a piece of dark, dense bread directly into your hands. It is warm. It is solid. It is life, freely given, asking nothing in return. In a year when people were selling their winter cloaks and their iron plowshares just to buy a handful of spoiled flour, the almoner's loaf was a quiet, staggering defiance of the famine's cruel arithmetic. The monks gave away their own security to keep strangers breathing for one more day. It was the mercy of a door that refused to stay shut and a hand that opened outward. The second mercy was the knowledge that kept them alive. When we looked at the famine diet, the bark bread, the boiled weeds, the ground acorns, we saw it as a measure of desperation. And it was. But if you look closer, beneath the desperation, there is something deeply beautiful. There is a vast, unwritten library of survival, held entirely in the minds of the people the world considered powerless. The people of the medieval village did not invent the knowledge of the hedgerows in a single season. The understanding of which roots could be boiled safely, which bark contained trace starches, and how long to leach the toxic tannins from an acorn in a running stream, this was hard-won, inherited wisdom. It was the knowledge of the very poor, passed down from grandmothers to mothers to daughters, whispered in the smoky kitchens and carried into the damp woods. It was an inheritance of survival, preserved against exactly such years. During the Great Famine, this knowledge became a lifeline, and crucially, it was shared. While some men hoarded their grain and counted their silver, the knowledge of the wild larder was freely given away. An older woman, whose bones remembered a lesser dearth from decades before, would show a younger neighbor where the water drop work grew thickest along the riverbank. She would show them how to dig for pig nuts, how to gather sweet Sicily and wild garlic, and which ferns to avoid. A family would share their foraging grounds with another, rather than defending it with violence. Hunger isolates. It drives people behind closed doors. But survival requires the community. The poor helped the poor. They walked together into the wet, dripping forests. They shared the heavy, flat stones needed to grind the tough elm bark. They shared the precious embers of a fire to boil the bitter greens, because keeping a fire lit in the relentless rain was nearly impossible for one exhausted family alone.
It is a profound, quiet mercy to realize that these people were not helpless victims waiting passively for the end. They were armed with the ancient knowledge of the earth, and they used it to fight for every single day of life, side by side. They belonged to the harvest now, but when the harvest vanished, they belonged to the woods, and they taught each other to read the forest floor like a book. It was a small rebellion of decency in a world that was trying to grind them down.
The third mercy is the greatest of all. It is the one we have been waiting for since the very first drop of rain fell in the spring of 1315. It is the mercy of an ending. The Great Famine was a slow, patient siege. It did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. And it waited through the ruin of 1315 and the catastrophe of 1316 and the agonizing, desperate spring of 1317. It waited so long that the people, exhausted and starving, began to believe it would never leave. They began to believe that the rain was simply the new condition of the world, a permanent punishment from a heaven that had locked its gates forever. But it did not wait forever. In the summer of 1317, the massive atmospheric engine that had locked northern Europe in a cycle of endless freezing storms finally began to shift. The heavy, slate-gray clouds that had hung over the continent for 3 years began to break apart. The wind changed direction, bringing drier air from the continent, and then, one morning, the sky was simply blue. The sound of the famine had been the metronome of the rain on the thatch, drum, drum, drum. But now that sound slowed, it faltered, and then it stopped entirely. Imagine the absolute ringing silence of that first dry week. The water began to recede from the flooded meadows, leaving behind thick, rich silt. The deep, clinging mud of the roads began to bake and harden in the warmth. The air, which had smelled of wet wool, damp ash, and rotting hay for 3 years, suddenly smelled of warm earth and green, growing things. The harvest of 1317 was not a miracle of sudden abundance. The seed corn was severely depleted, the oxen were dead or dying of the murrain, and the people holding the spades were weak and exhausted. But the grain they did manage to plant did not drown. The stalks of wheat and barley grew, they ripened, they turned a deep golden yellow in the late summer sun. When the reapers went into the fields, they were not wading ankle-deep in mud trying to cut rotting stalks. They were cutting dry, healthy grain and binding it into tight, crisp sheaves. You belonged to the harvest now. For 3 long years, that belonging was a death sentence. But as the sheaves of wheat were carried into the barns, that belonging became a salvation. The earth had remembered how to grow, and the people who belonged to it were going to be fed again. As the harvest of 1317 was milled and the even stronger harvest of 1318 followed, the terrible arithmetic of the market went in reverse. The manorial clerks who had spent years recording the steady climb of starvation wrote down new numbers. The price of a quarter of wheat, which had soared to an impossible 40 shillings, began to fall. It dropped to 30, then 20, then 10, then 6. The silver pennies in the laborer's purse could buy real bread again, not bark, not chaff, but heavy, sustaining bread.
And a new sound replaced the rain. It was the deep, rhythmic rumbling sound of the heavy stone mill wheels turning in the rivers, grinding the dry grain into fine flour. It was the sound of the market square filling with voices that were no longer whispering in despair. It was the ordinary, beautiful noise of a village that had survived. The Great Famine did not end all at once, and it did not leave the world unscarred. The cattle continued to die of the panzootic for years, leaving the pastures quiet. The bodies of the survivors carried the deep, invisible scars of malnutrition for the rest of their lives. The empty cottages stood at the edges of the villages, quiet, crumbling monuments to the people who did not make it. The grief was profound, and it was lasting. But the dying stopped. The villages endured. The fields grew green again. This is the final, quietest mercy of the years of the rain. A famine is not like death. It is a thing you can come the other side of. The people of the 14th century walked through an apocalypse made of water. They suffered, they starved, and they lost millions of their own, but they did not disappear. They shared their wild roots. They handed bread through the abbey gates. They planted the seed in the wet earth, and they waited for the sun, and the world went on. From today's view, this is the stabilization of a severe climatic anomaly, the restoration of agricultural yields, and the normalization of market prices following an unprecedented supply shock. From their view, it was the opening of the gates of heaven and the return of the sun to a world that had forgotten its warmth. And that's what's so chilling.
St Albans, England, 1318. The monk Johannes de Trocolo sits in the scriptorium of the great abbey, takes up his pen one last time to write about the grain, and records a single, quiet sentence of relief. Listen to what he wrote. The measure of wheat, which had been sold for 40 shillings, was now sold for 6 shillings and 8 pence. He wrote it down because the catastrophe was finally, mercifully lifting. He recorded the falling prices. He recorded the dry fields. He recorded the silver pennies that could suddenly buy bread again. And the worst part isn't the price, or the years they lost, or the terrible, echoing, empty spaces in the village. The worst part is the thing the survivors did not know. The famine ended, as all famines do, and the survivors did what survivors do. They planted the seed, they buried their dead, and they went back to the ordinary business of living. They looked up at a sky that had finally cleared, and they must have believed the worst was behind them. It was not. 31 years after the rain finally stopped, a ship would come into a Mediterranean harbor with something worse than hunger in its hold. And it would find a Europe already weakened, already thinned, and already taught exactly how quickly the world could end. Tonight, the long rain has finally stopped. We are walking out of the dark, damp fields of the 14th century. We are taking the last mile of a long walk home, looking at the world the famine left behind, and reading the marks it left on the stone, the wood, and the ice. The Great Famine was not the apocalypse, but it was the rehearsal. When the harvests returned in 1318 and the years that followed, the society that emerged into the sunlight was fundamentally altered. For 3 centuries, Europe had experienced a period of unprecedented, explosive growth. The population had swelled. The forests had been pushed back to make room for the plow. The cities had expanded into bustling hubs of trade. The medieval world had been defined by a deep, unspoken confidence in the earth's ability to provide. That confidence was permanently broken. The famine left behind a landscape that was physically and psychologically scarred. If you were a survivor walking out into the fields in the spring of 1318, you were stepping into a thinner, quieter world.
The villages were smaller, the margins of the fields were pulled back, the most difficult and stony land abandoned to the weeds because there were simply no longer enough hands to work it. The generational knowledge of the village had been severed. The elders who had sacrificed their own rations for the young were gone. The people who walked those fields were different too. A whole generation had learned that the sky could turn against them in an afternoon. They had learned that the granary could stand open and empty, that the neighbor could lock their door, and that the king could do absolutely nothing to save them. The 14th century had crossed a dark, invisible threshold, turning from an era of endless expansion into an era of compounding crisis.
You belonged to the harvest now, and the harvest had returned, and the survivors belonged to it again. They planted the oats, and they reaped the barley, and they lived. But they did so with a new, lingering wariness. They watched the clouds. They hoarded what they could. They went about the business of rebuilding, not knowing what belonged to them, coming over the sea, 31 years away. In the late autumn of 1347, a fleet of Genoese trading galleys arrived in the port of Messina, Sicily, carrying a cargo of spices, silks, and the bacterium Yersinia pestis. By 1351, the Black Death would sweep across the entirety of Europe, taking the lives of as much as half of the population. The Great Famine did not cause the Black Death. A bacterial plague operates on its own merciless biological logic, independent of the weather, and it would have been a catastrophe in any century. But the famine prepared the ground. It laid the foundation for a mortality that the world had never seen. The famine had struck a population that was already stretched to the absolute limits of its food supply, and it left behind a generation carrying the deep physical scars of severe malnutrition. The children born in the hungry years, who survived the bark bread and the boiled weeds, were the adults facing the plague. If you look at the skeletons excavated from 14th century cemeteries today, you can read the famine in their very bones. Osteologists, looking at the long bones of the legs and arms, the femurs and the tibias, frequently find something called Harris lines. These are dense, horizontal bands of bone that form when a child's growth completely stops due to severe starvation or extreme physical stress, and then restarts when food becomes available again. The people who died in the Black Death carried the Great Famine permanently written inside their bodies. Their immune systems had been compromised during their most critical years of development. Their biological resilience was worn thin. The famine had impoverished the peasantry, concentrated the vulnerable in crowded, desperate towns, and eroded the social safety nets. It did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. And its last, coldest turn was this. The famine waited, and it took its terrible toll, and then it quietly stepped back. It made room for the thing that came after. It set the stage for the plague that would not wait at all. But the story of the Great Famine is not just a story of the sickness that followed it. It is a story of a world caught in a massive, invisible gear of the Earth's climate, a gear that we are only now, centuries later, beginning to fully understand. For the chroniclers like Johannes de Troclos, the endless rains of 1315 were the wrath of God. They were a divine punishment for the pride and the sins of a wicked age. Lacking any science of meteorology, it was the only framework that made sense of the ruin. But today, the evidence of those years is not just written in monastic Latin. It is written in the wood and the ice and the earth. If you take a cross-section of an ancient European oak tree, a tree that was already growing in the early 14th century, you can see the Great Famine with your own eyes. The science of dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, reveals the exact story the manorial rolls tell, but without the ink. The rings for the centuries before 1315 are wide, even, and healthy, recording the long, warm, stable summers of the medieval warm period. But when you reach the rings for 1315, 1316, and 1317, the wood suddenly changes. The rings become incredibly narrow, pinched, and distorted. They record years of stunted, desperate growth, of freezing temperatures in midsummer, and of roots drowning in heavily saturated anaerobic soil. The same record is frozen in the glacial ice of Greenland and the high Alps. Ice cores drilled deep into the ancient glaciers, capturing the trapped air and dust of the medieval atmosphere, show a sudden dramatic shift in atmospheric chemistry in the second decade of the 14th century. They record a sharp drop in solar radiation, likely triggered by a cluster of massive volcanic eruptions in the tropics, which threw thick veils of sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, blocking the sun and triggering a catastrophic cooling effect across the northern hemisphere. These physical records tell us that the famine was the violent, shuddering transition between two climatic eras. The medieval warm period, which had allowed Europe to flourish and expand, was ending. The cooler, wetter, more volatile era that historians and climatologists sometimes call the Little Ice Age was beginning. The wrath of God that the barefoot processions tried to appease was, in physical reality, a profound change in the world's weather that no amount of fasting or prayer could ever have turned. What remains of the Great Famine today, 7 centuries after the rain finally stopped? There are the deserted medieval villages. Across the English countryside, in places like Horham Percy in the chalk hills of Yorkshire, you can walk across empty, rolling green pastures that look entirely natural at first glance. But if you look closely at the ground, especially when the sun is low in the evening and the shadows stretch out, you can see the shape of the past. The grass rises and falls in regular, unnatural geometric patterns. These are the earthworks. They are the physical footprint of the sunken lanes where the ox carts used to run. They are the raised platforms where the timber-framed cottages once stood. They are the boundary banks of the small peasant gardens where the foraging took place. Many of these villages did not die overnight, but they began their long, slow decline during the Great Famine. As the poorest tenants died or abandoned their ruined fields, leaving the land to be reclaimed by the sheep and the grass, the village shrank. The stone remembers. The field kept the exact shape of a vanished world, holding the memory of the houses under the quiet English turf. And then there is the parchment. In the quiet, climate-controlled reading rooms of modern archives, the manorial rolls still exist. The long strips of sheepskin, stitched together by clerks whose names are lost, still hold the tight columns of Roman numerals. You can run your finger down the column and read the exact moment the price of a quarter of wheat soared out of reach. You can read the price of the heavy iron spades sold by the desperate. You can read the sudden transfer of a family's ancestral land to a wealthy neighbor. And you can read the chronicles. Johannes de Trocello's annals survive, a fragile, irreplaceable witness to a tragedy that the people living through it could not explain. These documents are the ultimate surviving objects. They are the things that outlived the mud and the rain and the hunger, carrying the voices of the witnesses across the dark gulf of 700 years, waiting for someone to open the cover and listen. The sound of the rain on the thatch is gone. If you walk through those empty earthworks today, the rain is just weather again. It is no longer a death sentence. It is just water falling on the grass, nourishing the soil, doing exactly what rain is supposed to do. The distant, patient echo of the drumming has finally faded away. But the fragility that the medieval poor lived with is not entirely banished from the modern world. We live in an era of global supply chains, of massive agricultural surpluses, of genetically modified drought-resistant seeds. We are insulated from the weather in a way Johannes de Trochello could never have imagined. Yet the margin between a full table and an empty one is thinner than we like to admit. Famine has not vanished from the earth. Food security remains intimately tied to the stability of the climate, to the shifting of the rains, and to the quiet, invisible mechanisms of the planet that we are still learning to understand. We are still bound to the harvest, even if we buy our bread wrapped in plastic. We still live on a planet where a change in the wind or a failure of the rain can rewrite the fate of millions. From today's view, the Great Famine is a textbook study in climatic vulnerability, a chilling demonstration of what happens when an overextended demographic peak meets a sudden, profound shift in the atmospheric engine. From their view, it was a world that had forgotten how to feed its children, waiting in the cold for a sun that refused to shine. And that's what's so chilling.
London, England, 2026. Outside the thick, heavy glass doors of the British Library, the evening traffic moves in a steady, glowing stream along the Euston Road. The modern world is rushing by, full of noise and light and the endless, immediate demands of the present day. But inside the great brick building, deep within the climate-controlled corridors of rare books and music reading room, that world falls entirely away. A librarian walks quietly down the aisle between the rows of heavy, polished oak desks. Her footsteps are muffled by the thick carpet. She carries a gray, acid-free archival box in her hands. She brings it to a designated desk, setting it down gently on a specialized foam cradle, a device carefully designed to support and protect the fragile bindings of ancient things. She lifts the lid, and the air in the room, which is strictly monitored for its exact temperature and its precise level of humidity, meets a piece of parchment that was made 700 years ago. Listen to the silence of the room. It is a deep, reverent, heavy hush. There is no wind in here. There is no cold. There is no mud. And above all, there is no rain. Tonight we have walked a very long way. We have stood in the freezing, endless damp of the early 14th century, under a slate-gray sky that had turned its back on the earth. We have watched the grain rot in the waterlogged fields, and the cattle die in the flooded pastures, and the price of a single dark loaf of bread climb so incredibly high that it became a death sentence. But we are no longer in the wet gray twilight of the Great Famine. We are in the safe, quiet, sterile present, looking at the very thing that survived it. Inside the gray box lies a manuscript known to modern historians and archivists as Cotton M.S. Claudius D6. It is a thick, bound collection of medieval chronicles, and nestled among its many pages are the annals of Johannes de Trochello. Look closely at the physical object itself. The parchment is not paper. It is made of animal skin, likely calf or sheep, that was laboriously washed, stretched on a wooden frame, scraped clean with a crescent-shaped blade, and dried under immense tension until it was smooth enough to take the ink. You can still see the faint organic variations in the vellum,
the difference between the hair side and the flesh side of the skin. The ink on the page is iron gall, made from a careful ancient recipe of crushed oak galls, iron sulfate, and water. It is a mildly caustic mixture that bites deeply into the surface of the parchment, oxidizing as it dries. Over the intervening 7 centuries, the words have darkened from a pale, watery black to a rich, warm, rusted brown.
The handwriting is small, tight, and extraordinarily careful. It is the work of a man who was trained in the scriptorium to make every single letter uniform and perfect, even when the world outside his window was slowly coming apart. You can lean over the page today under the soft, warm, artificial lights of the reading room and see the exact lines where he set down the catastrophe. You can trace the Latin words for the unceasing rain. You can see the sentence where he records the unimaginable death of the poor in the streets and the squares. You can see the exact physical mark of a man trying to build a tiny wall of words against an overwhelming tide of starvation. The book is a miracle of endurance. This single object survived the endless damp of 1315. It survived the Black Death that swept through the monasteries 30 years later. It survived the dissolution of the abbeys under Henry VIII, the chaotic dispersal of the monastic libraries, the Great Fire of London, the Blitz, and the long, slow march of 700 years. The record was made by a man who watched the slow apocalypse and refused to let it be forgotten. And it is kept now in a silence he would have understood perfectly, the deep, protective hush of a place made to keep things safe. And Troclow's chronicle is not the only thing that survived. 60 miles to the southwest, in the highly secure, climate-controlled vaults of the Hampshire Record Office, the great manorial pipe rolls of the Bishop of Winchester still exist. They are long, heavy, awkward scrolls of parchment, stitched together end to end. If you are permitted to unroll them upon a long wooden table, you can see the meticulous, unfeeling columns of Roman numerals kept by the manorial clerks. You can read the exact price of a quarter of wheat in the desperate autumn of 1316. You can see the number 40 standing there in faded brown ink, recording the precise moment that a working family was priced out of their right to draw breath. The clerks did not write about grief. They wrote about shillings and pence and the heavy sacks of seed corn that had to be eaten because the winter was simply too cold to bear. The famine was a vast, slow-moving, incomprehensible tragedy, a tide of suffering that washed over millions of lives. But here, in the archives of 2026, it is contained, it is reduced to ink and parchment and numbers. It has been made safe. But we must remember that behind every one of those rusted brown numbers, there were people. The millions who starved in the years of the rain left almost no names behind. The landless laborers who dug the ditches, the mothers who foraged in the wet hedgerows for wild garlic and stinging nettles, the families who sat at the bare, unlit hearth and divided a single dark loaf of bark bread, they are gone. 1,000 villages of them faded quietly into the grass, leaving no diaries, no letters, no monuments in stone. They slipped into the record's cold numbers, and the earth closed over them.
But they are not entirely forgotten. The earth remembers them. If you walk across the Yorkshire wolds at dusk today, when the sun is low and the light is turning soft and golden, you can see the green earthworks of Warham Percy and 100 other deserted medieval villages. The rolling pastures are not flat. They hold the exact geometric shape of the sunken lanes where the carts used to run.
They hold the raised rectangular platforms where the timber houses stood, the houses that emptied out when the harvest failed and the people walked away. The grass kept the memory of the walls. The trees remember them too. In university laboratories across the world today, paleoclimatologists look at the cross-sections of ancient oaks through heavy microscopes, and they see the deep, pinched, distorted rings of 1315 and 1316. They look at the ice cores pulled from the deep, ancient glaciers of the Alps, and they read the volcanic ash and the sudden, terrifying drop in the world's temperature. The sky turned against the earth, and the earth recorded the blow in wood and ice, waiting for us to learn how to read it. They were not numbers. They were people who watched the sky and waited for a harvest that did not come. But most of all, the survival of the world they built is their monument, because the Great Famine did not end the story. The rain eventually broke, the sky cleared, the harvest returned, and the survivors, thin and grieving and exhausted, walked back out into the drying mud and planted the seed again. When you live in a world bound to the soil, every season is a gamble with the sky. You belonged to the harvest now. For 3 terrible years they belonged to a harvest that failed them utterly and completely. But when the earth finally remembered how to grow, they belonged to it again. And they lived. They endured the deepest mark, and they carried their heavy grief, and they went on to rebuild a world that has stretched all the way to the warm, quiet room where you are resting now. Famine is the slowest of all catastrophes. It is a patient, grinding wheel. It did not come to kill them quickly. It came to wait. But the waiting is over now. It has been over for 700 years. The long wait of the empty granary, and the long wait for the sun to break through the endless clouds, and the long wait for the heavy stone mill wheels to turn in the river, all of it is finished. The famine waited, but the record outwaited the famine. The parchment sat quietly in the abbey library, and then in the collector's study, and finally in the modern archive, waiting for us to come and open the box and remember them. The sound of those years was the endless, relentless metronome of the rain on the thatch. Drum, drum, drum. But if you listen closely to the night around you, that sound is entirely gone. There is only the hush of a safe room, the distant, comforting hum of the modern world, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. The rain has stopped. The fields are dry. The bread is on the table. From today's view, it is a manuscript of the 14th century, a vital piece of demographic and economic history resting quietly under glass. From their view, it was the only way to make sure the suffering of a drowning world would not be washed away. And that's what's so chilling. The night is over. The long walk is done. The archive is closing its heavy doors, and the parchment is going gently back into the dark, where it will wait safely for tomorrow. It is time to let the rain fade away and leave the fields of 1315 behind. Sleep well.